It's very nice to welcome you here to the Union this evening. My name is Adam Were. I am affiliated with the Centre for Geopolitics, and my job before we get to the main event is to just set some context for you about what we've been doing here today on behalf of the Centre, because it frames, hopefully, the discussion that we are going to have with our expert panel this evening. So for the last 10 years now, the Centre has been engaged in what we call our strategic simulation series, where we take a subject of topical interest and importance in international relations and politics, and we recreate the government crisis response mechanisms with people from government, both currently serving and former, and join them with our MPhil cohorts, many of whom are in the room, and other interested people from across the university. And we run in real time a simulated crisis response based on the COBRA mechanism in the centre of government. And for those who perhaps from other countries, that is our equivalent of the situation room that you would find in the White House. We've been extremely fortunate with the list of people who've given their time. We always have a former UK Secretary of State playing the role of Prime Minister, and today we were very lucky to have Amber Rudd, former Home Secretary, play her part, and indeed it's possible, Amber, that you might get asked the odd question from the panel. But yes, we should put you in the armchair. She was joined by a range of people from a diverse range of government departments, Foreign Office, Ministry of Defence, Cabinet Office. We hadn't planned it as such, but this is obviously an auspicious date. There are a few that you can point to back through history, as we like to do in the Centre, but it feels like the world may be changing on a halfpenny this afternoon. And when we were thinking about what we needed to examine, we thought we needed to go to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter, the key question for us is, what is President Trump going to do about Ukraine? And why is that important? It's important for so many reasons. But the most important reason, actually, is what it means for the people of Ukraine. But it's also extremely important to work out what it means for the people of this country and for Europe, and indeed, actually, for the whole world. So it's quite a big deal. And that was what we were grappling with under Amber's expert chairmanship. And I just want to give you a few bullet points, a few sort of ideas of what came out, and give you a flavour of the scenario that we were operating under. And broadly, and perhaps depressingly for many people in the room, it was that the Russians were pressing forward at an increasing rate into Ukraine, and that it is becoming more apparent that Ukraine is under military pressure that could easily end in a defeat, or potentially end in a defeat. And so we were working backwards from that possibility and seeing what that meant. We also worked in, as we always do, some really difficult and knotty tactical issues that face any government when they're dealing with a crisis. Something bad happens, and the population expects the Prime Minister and his or her team to deal with it. They're not necessarily, the population, thinking about the long-term strategic implications of the consequences of dealing with the tactical situation. So we had a heady mix of embassy sieges, deterioration of public order in various places around the periphery of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. What we found, I think, and others will have comments and views, and encourage the students who were involved to ask questions of the panel, is that the future of Ukraine and how this story ends will have immediate and important knock-on effects on the surrounding countries, as well as obviously the effects for the Ukrainian people themselves. And those knock-on effects have further knock-on effects, and eventually those effects arrive at the door of the United Kingdom and other countries. And at that point, I'm going to sort of hand it over, because we have experts here who can talk through and about what we found. So I would like to hand the mic over to Brendan, who's the director of the centre, and he's going to take it from there.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, and good evening to you all. Our subject this evening is the resilience of Ukraine, and we have got two excellent panelists who are both going to speak for about 10 minutes each. Immediately to my right, we have Victoria Vidovichenko, Dr. Victoria Vidovichenko, who is from Vinnytsia in Ukraine, is a widely respected and known expert on the security of Ukraine, particularly the security of the Baltic Sea region and the Mediterranean as well. And more to the point, is the co-director of the Future of Ukraine program at our Centre for Geopolitics here in Cambridge. And then to her right is Rory Moylan. He's had a long career in the Red Cross. He was part of the International Committee of the Red Cross, during which period he served in many countries, many conflict zones, in particular in Ukraine. He's got extensive knowledge of large-scale humanitarian operations, which we'll be bringing to this discussion. And again, specifically, he is now the head of region for the Middle East, for North Africa and Europe, for the British Red Cross. So as I say, we've got expertise from both sides on this question. So Victoria, I'll hand over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Brendan, and good evening, everyone. It's a really pleasure and honor to be with you and represent not only my country, but even my city, which has one of the twinning cities, which is Peterborough, which is just over here, near to Cambridge as such. I have 5 points, just in opening remarks, and then, of course, we can continue with some of the ideas. Things that really matters for us is, as you've seen in the program, socioeconomic challenges. At the same time, what's happening with the Ukrainian economy. And I'll try to dive it into in understanding what's happening on the ground as well. We Ukrainians called 2024, specifically 2024, Killing Ukraine Softly year. For a matter of different reasons. A matter of not receiving the ammunitions and, of course, aid on time. And, December 2024 demonstrated that Biden administration, already former president as we speak now, right, of the United States, did, with a huge delay, some of the military aid packages, as we were speaking, one of the biggest, actually 5 of them happening. Second point is, of course, 2024 marked by what we say bilateral political and potentially security reassurances. They are not even agreement. It's a kind of a political willingness or framework, and UK was actually the first one on January 12th last year, as well as continuation last week when Prime Minister Keir Starmer was in Kyiv signing 100 years political, what we say, security assurances, supporting and understanding how UK is backing up Ukraine in this matter. So that's a very important step. And such bilateral agreements were signed 28 as for a moment, with not only UK, but many other countries, as well as EU in a nutshell, and potentially also discussion was in later. So what's there in this last deal or century-long partnership agreement, because it's a partnership agreement as such. First of all, it's a provision of arms and military equipment to Ukraine, collaboration in the defense industrial sector, where there is a much more of the potential in backing up Ukrainian economy, not only backing and developing what we say rampant European defense sector, because that's a very important point to take into account. Third one is a cooperation in maritime capabilities. Here we're talking about Black Sea and the Azov Sea in a nutshell. And of course, that's how Brendan mentioned Mediterranean, because they're very much interconnected into the strategic interest of all of the countries. And number 5, developing rapid response mechanisms, specifically in understanding what if Russia continues to drop not only bombs, but many of other artillery shells and other equipments on Ukraine, what will be a response from the UK? And actually, it's one of the, let's say, highest in terms of agreements of such kind with Ukraine for a moment. High, it means for a duration. So 100 years is the longest term that we still signed, and we literally think that it would go in an understanding of other countries to see it as a template, as we call it, for other agreements with other countries moving on. At the same time, last week was important in terms of 2 things that came to my mind before I come literally diving into socioeconomics. Ministry of Defense of 4 different countries were visiting Kyiv, where actually Prime Minister of Ukraine was, and where the drone attack where your Prime Minister was happened in Kyiv. And actually, the day before yesterday hit also education institution where I was studying. So literally, it was a Minister of Defense of Italy, Minister of Defense of Germany, Netherlands, and Denmark, Minister of Foreign Affairs, apologies. So these 4 countries were paying the visit before Donald Trump's going up as a new president, in understanding what kind of ideas backing up on the European security architecture can work in understanding what will be important for, of course, going on into defense cooperation as such. And we can say that the Danish model of the defense cooperation is one of the most successful for a moment, and I'll be happy to elaborate it maybe in the Q&A more. And literally these joint production lines, for the first time with Italian, because Italy is hosting a recovery and reconstruction conference in Rome in July this year, immediately after the NATO summit in June. So literally, European companies as well as governments, in a nutshell, they are interested in this joint product lines production, because what we have is a morale and the willingness to do that as fast as possible. At the same time, European companies, I'm talking in a broader sense, UK also included, they have the R&D, as would you say, and the centers of excellence where the technologies can be implemented on the ground, what we see Ukrainian soul. And now let's talk to more about economic challenges as well as the resilience of the regions of Ukraine in this. Naturally, it's important also to mention. So, when we talk about economic figures, of course, we have to talk about GDP of Ukraine and understanding that it's not growing, but it's recovering from what was on a strike since 2022. So GDP is still more than 20% lower than in 2021. After falling by 28.8% year on year in 2022, the economy recovered only by 5% in 2023 and 4% in 2024. Better logistics and the development of the defense industry had a positive impact on this recovery. That's why I mentioned these joint production lines and opening of some of the companies who are interested of their centers. German and specifically some of the UK companies are there. Literally, economic recovery is decreasing. In general, that's the trend. This is what we can say. But at the same time, businesses enter in 2025 with negative expectations. These negative expectations are due to deterioration of security situation and increase of shelling of energy facilities continue to have the greatest negative impact. In a nutshell, when we talk about the damages, there are 5 categories here, and I'm just enumerate you some of them. The largest category of total damages is not agriculture, as anyone is thinking, or critical infrastructure. No, it's housing sector. Housing sector is in total over 167,200 housing units have been destroyed, and result of hostilities comprising about 148,000 private homes. So at least people are homeless, or they don't have the houses where to come to. The second largest category of damaged assets is infrastructure, which you've seen more in the media. Critical infrastructure is a part of it. In a nutshell, overall 18 airports at least, 350 bridges and overpasses, and over 25,000 of kilometers of highways and roads have been damaged. The next category definitely comes agriculture, one of our strongest points in terms when we are talking about economy and of course export operation and such. The total agricultural damages are estimated as of $8.7 billion, or 30% of all capital accumulated in Ukrainian agriculture before 2022. A separate, nonetheless, very important thing, because we are talking about agriculture, is land destruction. Land destruction caused by mines and residue of military operations. Ukraine is certainly now, in 2025, still the most mined country, not only in Europe, I would say, even in the continent, with an estimate of 16 million hectares being mined. Just to put you some of these figures and geographically understanding what does it mean, 11.2 million of these hectares are farmlands in Ukraine. To put it in perspective, is comparable to the landmass of all farmlands in Germany. So huge. Just to understand you the scale of the damages and devastation. And last but not least, something which me as associate professor is always talking about, education is under danger. Significantly affected with damages amounted to $3.1 billion. The total number of damaged and destroyed educational facility exceeds 3,500, including about 2,000 of secondary schools, 1,000 preschools, 586 higher educational institutions, like this one, for example. So what positive things have happened in 2024, and this is something I will stop afterward as a point of discussion, what we say international patronage of the regions. In Ukraine now there are 6 different regions, just for your understanding. Those who came under occupation since 2014, when the annexation of Crimea happened, and of course Donbass and Lugansk, what we say Green Man operation started, and of course it was, and these regions are still there. The occupation that happened since 2022, and the territories were not liberated, the occupations that happened since 2022 and the territories were liberated, what we say regions like mine, economy in the rear, so it means those who received the majority of the IDPs from other regions of Ukraine. That's why Vinnyts, as the name was mentioned today in the simulations games, in a particular understanding the migration flow of a country big as Ukraine. And last but not least, there are only 2 cities in Ukraine still existing that never heard of sirens and the missiles attack. Is Uzhgorod. That's why think about Orban, why he wants Fico wants to go only to Uzhgorod to meet President Zelensky or other Ukrainian leaders, let's say in terms of ministries or prime minister, specifically for the city, and Chernivtsi, which is bordering with Romania. And we haven't touched upon it in our simulation, but that's just something important, because Chernivtsi is literally in the control of airspace of Romania. That's why Chernivtsi never been touched so much in a nutshell. So patronage, for example, Denmark is already supporting Mykolaiv region. UK is supporting some of the regions in central, and Kyiv as a city itself. Italy is supporting Kharkiv. Greece is supporting Mariupol, because for ethnic community of Greek people populated there, even Mariupol is still under the occupation. They are thinking about the projection of how reconstruct and rebuild it later. So definitely the key areas for work in this domain for 2025, construction of social housing, and you heard why this figure was important. Number 2, construction of water supply systems in different regions, construction of water pipelines, energy efficiency, and something that I was responsible for my city in 2024, replacement of street lighting system, installation of solar panels as alternative source of energy, and of course, because we have almost 80% of our critical energy infrastructure hit, that's the moment where the alternative sources are coming into. So something like energy islands is the very term that we are using in a nutshell. And of course, 2 last but not least points, demining, because it's a huge a mission and for many months going, and rehabilitation centers, not only for the wounded soldiers, but for the people who literally when you are talking about the sirens and the attacks, it's even hit the babies. So literally, when we want to think about the future generation, and of course your question will come to the conscription and all of that on the mobilization point, it's very important also to support the people who do understand how let's say, the PTSD syndromes sometimes literally hit not only the soldiers, but the civilians. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us in your evening time as well. I want to touch on a few points as well. I'm going to go for 4, not 5, but I was also making a few notes as well from things that you were talking about, because I saw some real overlap that I'll try and tie into that as well. I'm going to start with a bit of the role of the Red Cross in Ukraine. When I talk about that, I'm going to be talking primarily about the role of the Ukrainian Red Cross, not the British Red Cross, but we do have an established partnership with them, and we look for ways that we support them through the provision of funding, technical expertise, and advocacy support. I'll also link in there the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross as well, the part of our movement that has a specific role inside conflict and the guardian of the Geneva Conventions. I'd also then like to look at areas where, in terms of building that resilience of civilian population, that the state is struggling and still requires support, what else might be needed inside that. Also kind of looking at what the gaps might be there as well, and then perhaps trying as best as possible to have an eye to the future, the role of the humanitarian sector broadly. Of course, I'll be speaking mostly about the Red Cross view of this in return, resettlement, and some of the long-term rehabilitation of Ukraine. So I might start then with just the nature of Red Cross response inside Ukraine and how that has had to build. And I think it was right you pointed to this not just being since 22, it's been since 2014. You have elements of population that have required that immediate humanitarian support, very short term, but also longer term needs since that time. You have some populations and some people that I know personally who have been displaced on multiple occasions, and obviously that has increased in the last years. So we found ourselves having to look at how do you address very urgent needs of people who might be closer in particular to areas of hostilities, and with kind of longer term needs as people have kind of started to fall through social welfare cracks, of course, as Ukraine has been under immense, not just military pressure, but economic pressure, as Victoria was also rightly highlighting. Those key activities then, of course, are ones that you could all probably rightly imagine, but around health, infrastructure rebuilding of health, home-based care services, particularly for elderly and extremely vulnerable, and a range of immediate humanitarian relief programs as well, focused around the distribution of cash for people to meet their basic needs, but also to find alternative sources of livelihoods in new communities in which they find themselves in Ukraine. Physical rehabilitation has been an area of quite significant expansion for the Red Cross. That's also looked at not just civilians, but also military personnel. I might talk about that a little bit as well at the end when we look at kind of what the future outlook is as well. And as well, there's also been an intense need to step up the Red Cross's role in disaster response and search and rescue. So the Ukraine Red Cross now forms, which it didn't before, part of the government of Ukraine's emergency response protocols. So, for example, in the event of an airstrike, they will be part of the teams that are called out to provide immediate response for civilian population, to help in the search and rescue, and provide immediate support to those affected. There's also an intense effort in first aid training, again, kind of building the ability of a population to, in certain instances, look after itself. And also in building awareness around weapons contamination, so safety around unexploded ordnance, and particularly obviously in urban areas. So what you've seen is kind of some of the traditional roles of the Red Cross in Ukraine, but then also adapting and expanding to meet an ongoing conflict, and one that covers much of the territory of Ukraine. Thinking then in terms of where is the state struggling. I'm obviously going to kind of choose my words carefully there. But I think there's there's one thing, and when I try and link this to the resilience of, and we've seen this in other contexts, but the extent to which a government will rely on the resilience of its population to just make its way through this when they themselves are not able to provide all of the services that they should do, when they're under immense military pressure, immense economic pressure, obviously the mental strain, again, that Victoria touched on as well, and they rely on their populations to kind of muddle through. There is a limit to that, and I think we're starting to see bits of that, particularly in areas of mental health, in physical rehabilitation, prosthetics, and so on. But it is something that is a bit of a reality, I think. I do not think that's something deliberate, but I think it is just a reality that populations have to endure. But there is real limits to that. I think there's also a real importance around how international organizations can fill critical holes at particular times. We as the Red Cross have a requirement to do this. We operate as auxiliaries to our national governments, so we are by definition able to fill some of these gaps, but there are again limits to this. And the problem that we find as humanitarian actors, of course, is that the solutions to things are not humanitarian. We are basically a plaster. We try to be a good one and try to be an efficient one, but we're not the solution, and the solutions are political. As long as that situation carries on, we can just do the best we can to mitigate. And that is, again, where we find this kind of interaction with the state itself, in that we're unable to address the fundamental root cause of what is causing a problem for a civilian population. Thinking then of what else is needed, we again find ourselves trying to maintain a focus on the humanitarian narrative and trying to keep people at the center of this. And again, I'm not trying to just steal your points, I promise. I was really sort of listening and paying attention to that, of just the need of rebuilding housing, of the mental health concerns that people will have, but it's also still without there actually being a fixed context with which we're responding to. There is talk of settlement, there is talk of negotiation, but we haven't seen that. So we don't know exactly how to address that. We find ourselves needing to respond to immediate needs without being able to plan for the very long term. Our role, we see in that also, is in almost an advocacy space, or in influencing government and decision makers to keep the humanitarian focus in whatever discussions are coming, and in any discussions around the long-term rehabilitation and reconstruction of Ukraine. How are people, how are civilians a real focus point of that as well? I would also just then like to pick up on the idea and the notions around how the Red Cross and others can support returns and resettlements of Ukrainians coming back to Ukraine. We've seen a kind of an ebb and a flow of people coming back and forth in and out of Ukraine. It's obviously mainly women and children, men not being able to, in the main part, leave Ukraine due to military restrictions. That hasn't led to permanent returns. There's obviously a big question mark of when that might start happening, and how do we again start to help fill that space. The first point that I think we can try to do on that is to again influence policy, and we do a lot of work in the international space, and the Ukrainian Red Cross do a lot of work with their government to introduce ideas to their authorities around what is the best way to support your civilians as they come back. I do think as well there's a very large question mark around what do you do for Ukrainians that don't come back as well? How do you manage the fact that you might have a population decrease as well? And then perhaps with a view to a potential settlement at some point, what would happen if men were allowed to leave the country and reunite with Ukrainians who have decided to make a new life in other particularly European countries and further afield perhaps as well. So I might sort of stop there and wrap up, but that's kind of where we constantly find ourselves in this space between the long and the short term, providing humanitarian assistance, but all the time knowing that we are ourselves not the solution to these issues, and really just trying to work as best as we can to an advisory to authorities and decision makers on how to keep that focus on people.
Well, thank you very much indeed. So I've got some questions now for our panelists, and then I'll open it up to you, the audience. My first one really is for Victoria. And you alluded to it very briefly, this tension between military requirements and demographic resilience. And actually it comes out in something that Rory raised as well, which is, I suppose, on the one hand, the need to mobilize as many troops as possible. On the other hand, to maintain the population, particularly the younger population. And so you have this question around why Ukraine is not recruiting men in their early 20s, which has been something that's been much, yeah. But so I'd be interested to have your view on that. And then picking up on what Rory said, which was the question of just the overall demographic resilience of Ukraine in a context where so many Ukrainians have left. Now, obviously, you personally are in a slightly different position because you're an advocate for your country here, and so in a sense, you're part of that effort. But of course, there are many Ukrainians who've left for reasons of personal safety who are unlikely to go back for one reason or another to Ukraine. And as was just said, these are women and children preponderantly, but of course at the end of the armed conflict, or at least of this round of armed conflict, that opens up the question of whether the men will then leave, and so there will be potentially an even greater outflow. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on how Ukraine is thinking about mitigating this challenge.
I'll try to brief on some of the questions if I pick that. I think you've heard about the new ministry that's been created of national unity, very challenging ministry in terms of understanding why Ukrainians should be united. But the idea behind that is literally to work what we say the new Ukrainian diaspora. The new Ukrainian diaspora, it means those who left since 2022, and literally to have a contact with them. You're absolutely right, Brandon, to use the momentum that these Ukrainians are the advocates in the countries where they temporarily reside in, which might lead to, let's say, permanent residing or might not. There are different conditions. Let me tell you the stories. For example, if you're from Mariupol and you're fleeing because your territory is completely occupied, it's a slightly less probability for you to be returning back because, first of all, and after Russian captivity, there is nothing human left in terms of housing, living, land, as we were, from my opening remarks. So recovering those territories and involving the people to be left in such cases will be much more problematic and challenging. For example, if we're talking about Western Ukraine or Central Ukraine, like my city for a moment, right, where the shellings are not captivating, even if attacking the civilian infrastructure as we speak, but at the same time, the motivation will be slightly different. So what to do in this sense? So I definitely agree that the approach should be, and that's why the Ministry of this Unity was created with Minister Chernyshov now trying to literally elaborate the approach as well as the roadmap, what to do in the terms that literally will need Ukrainians to return back in order to recover and reconstruct. At the same time, our Ukrainians are very creative in terms of, not creative economy, don't get me wrong, in terms of a creative adapting the approaches. It's a part of our resilience. So literally we are using the momentum not to sit idly, but you've heard many Ukrainians in your communities as well who are creating something, who are relocating their businesses, and then actually using this momentum to pay not only double taxation, but use it momentum for the UK economy, and it's happening as we speak. Poland is much more brilliant case in this sense because we have much more Ukrainians who were relocated, and the easiness of how the Polish authorities gave the access for Ukrainian businesses to be relocated and literally jumped to some of the percentage even their GDP. So believe me, these countries, even Romania is the case on that. Romanian members of parliament were asking me how to make it sure that Ukrainians will not be returning out of Romania because of this reason, that Ukrainian companies, especially those who are in the Miltech or IT, they are very much in demand of even this government in this country in a nutshell. So it's also a projection. For example, the challenge we have with Italian authorities now is how to get back children out of Italy, those who were relocated, especially from the occupied areas, because Italian authorities and communities are very much interested in maintaining them and literally raising the new generation. highly motivated, very much eager to not only to the high level of the education, but at the same time the skill set that they are bringing and the mindset. So this is another challenge that we are having actually, to how to return Ukrainians who are in the third case, as I'm on train, to say those who are successful abroad. That's something that it kind of might sound for you maybe not a case, but it is a case actually when we're thinking of that. There are many other cases, and no doubts. I just wanted to enumerate some of these that haven't been mentioned or haven't been thought even in a nutshell. Definitely, there are going to be also those families who will not be willing, because of the trauma, to get back to what we say, to where the trauma was happening, and it's very much understandable. Those who would like to be back because there are all other members of their family and they want to support their elder, for example, members of family. There will be many, many of these stories. So therefore, the demographics in Ukraine is changing as we speak, because that the shellings, at the same time the strikes, are happening as we speak as well. So literally, it provokes of the discussion how the youngsters gonna respond for that. And in this sense, I have a slightly interesting poll that I prepared from, and I really much recommend you to look through some of this data. It's a Democratic Initiative Ilko Kucherev Foundation. They are doing polls very regularly basis, and literally there are two things that they are always asking. What Ukraine will do, how you Ukrainians would like to see Ukraine in the future. Would you like to see your future in Ukraine? Yes, but only if the Russian occupation stops. So that's very important. And not because energy infrastructure strikes now. No, it never stopped the Ukrainians to be back, but because of the Russian captivity and the hostilities that the Russian troops are bringing to Ukrainian territory. Now, even with the help of other troops from North Korea, for example, in particular, and we still don't know what this new partnership that Russia Federation signed with Iran a couple of days ago literally means for 2025.
Thank you. Roy, one of the points you made was that by its very nature, the work of the Red Cross is ameliorative. It's not, you don't solve, generally speaking, the problem. You mitigate it. I think the phrase you use, you're a sticking plaster. Now, and the problem is political, as you say, and it always is. How does that affect your relationship with the Russian state and the Russian forces, and indeed your relationship with the Red Cross in that country? How is that negotiated for you?
So, good question. I'm sure there's someone inside the Red Cross who isn't happy that I called us a plaster, but we're gonna persevere. We're gonna keep going. It's fine. It's not being recorded, so it's okay. So first, maybe to start with the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross. So the part of our movement who is mandated to operate as a neutral body, a neutral intermediary at points inside conflict. So they are the part of our movement who can and should, according to Geneva Conventions in this case, operate on occupied territory. So they should be the ones who are providing humanitarian services in the areas of Ukraine that are currently occupied. So that's an extremely important part of our movement in terms of delivering that service. The Ukrainian Red Cross itself is unable to do that, and that is why we have that part of our movement to be able to do that. As you then point to, we also have, of course, the Russian Red Cross, which operates in the territory of the Russian Federation itself, and only within the territory of the Russian Federation. I think that's a really important first point to make. They do not operate outside the territory of the Russian Federation. The same rules of our movement, and these are defined inside our principles as a movement, that there can only be one national society in one territory. Those same rules apply, for example, to the Ukrainian Red Cross inside the Kursk pocket, currently occupied by Ukrainian armed forces. So those rules are tantamount to us. They're of extreme importance, and because I think as well, it's how, in part, we maintain our reputation for consistency of response, the trust with authorities as well. And again, it's about the principles that we have as a movement that bind us. Those are also principles, and also I would add to that the code of conduct that we establish as a movement that are basically adopted by the entire humanitarian sector as being ones that we should all be sticking to in delivering those. Key of that, of course, is neutrality and impartiality as well, in addition to the points I made about there only being one national society on one given territory. But it's a really important point in this particular context in Ukraine as well. And I think I've finished. I would just be going on.
Thank you. So there are many more things I'd like to ask, but I'm just going to pose one more question to Victoria, and then I'm going to open it up to you. You began actually by referring to the recent agreement between Ukraine and the United Kingdom, and you put a certain sort of importance, you ascribed a certain importance to that agreement. Can you say a little bit more about the way in which you and Ukraine see the role of the UK in this story? I mean, is it the case that this is, something that is fundamentally critical? Is it something where the UK is perhaps overreaching? What's the sort of status of the UK in Ukraine's thinking about this war and its resilience?
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, indeed, as I tried to mention in the opening remarks, we do see this partnership agreement, because it's a partnership agreement for a moment. There is, of course, a political element to that, as something new in the benchmark, what missing of NATO, let's say, membership, at least something in terms of taken out of the coalition of will. And for those who don't know, there are 8 coalitions, and the UK is leading in the maritime coalition. That's why I mentioned the importance of the Black Sea and Azov Sea in terms of understanding that the maritime fights or talks are come back in power again as we speak. That's why Mr. Trump, I hope I don't know, but still have chosen Panama as a kind of idea, as the same as Taiwan in Indo-Pacific, as a kind of coming back to real politics and power, as we know. So in this sense, we do see this partnership agreement as something, as a new mechanism of still supporting in the implementation of the coalition of willing. Because for a moment, as I was saying, there are 28 political agreements, so it means framework. Legally speaking, it's nothing in terms of, because there is no implementation mechanism. The President's office literally created a special position of one of the generals, where his idea and his ambition is to literally to talk with his vis-a-vis. But the problem is there are no vis-a-vis, because the countries with whom Ukraine signed these 28 agreements, they didn't create this implementation mechanism such, so there are no coordination, what we say intergovernmental, enough in all of the countries. So UK is still in this momentum to be advanced, and therefore we are looking forward for this partnership, how it will be developed, and of course we hope so that in a nutshell, when we talk about joint production lines, specifically defense lines, which I think will be much more important when we're also talking about maritime drones, where Ukraine is pretty much successful and has success since autumn 2024. It's been innovative within the technology of the UK that it can bring, and literally within the quantity and high speed volume of what we need. It's going to be very much produced and put into what we say idea that yes, we don't have NATO membership, and I'm just again taking into account the poll numbers. Security membership is NATO membership in a nutshell. When we are talking about, is seen by Ukrainians as the guarantee we are lacking for a moment. And for a moment, there is no other mechanism existing and binding enough to provide that. So therefore, we are trying to be innovative, at the same time talk to our partners, but it's very hard, in a nutshell, understanding if there is no other mechanism. So it's hard to think about even the future in this sense.
Thank you. So we now actually have plenty of time for questions. I see already a number of hands up. Could you please give your name and your affiliation if you have one? Yes. And on the left.
Thank you very much. Donatas Kupčuna, Center for Geopolitics. I've got a question for each of the speakers. So my question for the Red Cross expert is, can you tell us something about war crimes in the Russo-Ukrainian war? What are the trends? In what way this war is different or similar to other wars you have seen? What are the most frequent war crimes? How each side is dealing with war crimes? How are war crimes prosecuted by each of the sides? And in particular, I was wondering if you know something about Bucha, what happened in Bucha, because, you know, until now, Ukrainians maintain that it was something akin to a crime against humanity, while Lavrov, as always, says that, you know, this was Ukrainian PSYOPs operation designed to gather support for Ukraine. And my question for Victoria is, how do you deal with one particular difficulty, a legal difficulty, which is a NATO clause in Ukrainian constitution that Poroshenko hammered in, I think, in 2019 or something. Because it's clear that the Americans don't want Ukraine in NATO, especially Trumpian Americans. And it's also clear that one of the key Russian demands, if there are going to be negotiations, is precisely for Ukraine to renounce, and for the West also to renounce once and for all, that Ukraine is never going to become a member of NATO. So how do you think of solving this issue? Thank you.
Yeah, do you want to?
I don't mind. Yeah, sure. Good. So we're starting with the easy ones. That's great. We're leaning in gently. So perhaps disappointingly, no, I can't really talk about that, and I'll kind of outline why. First, I think it's important to say as well, I'm not a lawyer of any specialization, so that's probably an important caveat here as well. The reason for saying no is it's not actually the role of the Red Cross to look at these as well. So there will be different legal frameworks that will be applicable here. Again, I'm not going to start kind of outlining those, because I'll do a pretty bad job of it, I would have thought. Of course, you have, what's really important in this context is you do have the applicability, full applicability of Geneva Conventions. So those apply. Those are, because it's an international armed conflict between two states. So that's your kind of, one of your, and I would say probably your key legal framework, which is applying here. We then have the ICRC, again, so the International Committee of the Red Cross, who is charged with upholding that. And a really important part of what they do is to hold dialogue with parties to the conflict, all parties to the conflict, on the conduct of hostilities and how those impact civilians. That is private, confidential dialogue that they hold with states or with parties to the conflict. So it's not something where there will be public reports or publications of any sort as well. That can seem very limiting because it then doesn't, in this case, answer the question openly. I also wouldn't be privy to that information because I don't work for the ICRC itself anymore. I work for the British Red Cross. And that is, as I said, that's dialogue that's held confidentially with states and with armed actors as relevant. That, by the way, would be dialogue that is held with Ukrainian armed forces and Ukrainian government as well, relating to the conduct of hostilities. There is also, and just because you specifically mentioned Bucha, I would imagine, I don't know for sure, but when I would have been working at the ICRC, if I'd have heard of something like that, it would have been part of my role to document by speaking to people, if I've heard of, and speaking to civilians who have witnessed themselves directly or who have family members involved, to build that evidence base for that private confidential dialogue with the states in question. Perhaps to kind of anticipate why private and confidential, it's another way of trying to influence behavioral change and to influence adherence to those international norms. You can debate to what extent those are upheld in any conflict, but that is the approach that the Red Cross movement takes. Other organizations, human rights groups, would go for a publication. They'll go for a kind of a public campaign, a kind of a denouncement, basically, and that isn't the approach that we take. I hope that addresses it.
I can take some pieces of information for both of the questions. Yes, indeed, the war crimes is one of, as you remember, points out of 10 peace plan of Zelensky, because the documenting of the war crime as well as thinking how to help the victims who were suffering within the war crime is something very important in restoring justice for Ukrainian people, and especially those who became the victims. Since February 24, law enforcement agencies in Ukraine never stopped in documenting, and we definitely used the practices of some of the countries. There were 9 countries since March 2022 who are operating on the Ukrainian territory. UK or British experts are one of them. I will not name others, but still they are there. So as of beginning of 2024, I still don't know the dates, the data for beginning of 2025. There were 84,000 criminal proceedings, according to the President Volodymyr Zelensky. And it's a very small amount still of those who the documentation is happening. In addition to the law enforcement agencies, civil society organizations have also contributed and volunteered to do that in documenting those crimes. There are more than 2,000 of such civil society organizations who are doing that locally, or let's say national level of Ukraine, different levels. And of course, they are working in the not only Kyiv region, because Bucha is only one place. No one is talking about Borodyanka or specifically the newly occupied territories in the Donetsk, Zaporizhia region or Kherson region. The massive of the war crimes happening there, even overseas sometimes, according to the data of some of the experts, the Bucha, which became a kind of a symbolic name for all of, let's say, war crimes that started to be happening because of Russian troops entering and occupying or trying to occupy parts of Ukrainian, not only land, but literally people, and neutralize them. That's correct term, or kill them. Or torture them. So we are not talking about the prisoners of war, again, who are still in the Russian captivity. We are talking also about civilian population, women and children integrated in particular. You definitely heard about the figures of almost 20,000 of Ukrainian children being deported, which the Prosecutor's General Office is responsible for that, and they are keeping the track as we speak. If I would have an access to the data monitoring, you can literally see it on the children.gov.ua, that's the website, where you can see the tracking, monitoring mechanism of how and how many children have been returned to Ukrainian territory. Believe me, it's a very small amount of people in this sense. So literally, we're talking about this challenge as such. Who is investigating? Definitely National Police, Security Service, State Bureau of Investigation, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and many, many other offices together with the Office of the Prosecutor General. And now I'll come back to the second question, because it's very much interrelated to one more interesting point why I haven't mentioned the parts of the 100-year partnership agreement. It's about the establishment of military bases. There's something that was proposed there, and it's checking to the amendment of the Article 17 of the Constitution of Ukraine. So NATO membership, or to be precisely, Euro-Atlantic integration, that's the correct term of how in the Constitution of Ukraine we were updating, and it's not because of the President Poroshenko at that time willingness, but it's actually the willingness of Ukrainian people together with European integration. There are two factors of the foreign policy of Ukraine, and we are still proving that we are having that back on track. European Commission just issued at the beginning of January what we say the screening report in 2025, and we are preparing to open some of the benchmark, in particular one of the clusters, and where the fundamentals is the first cluster to be open and the last, as you know, for continuing the European integration track. Related to the Euro-Atlantic integration track, it's going to be very hard. And to tell you the truth, Donatas, I don't know for a moment, not because I don't know per se, but there are many options that might go in terms how United States is going to see. Now we can say new president because it's 15 minutes that he is already the president for a moment as we speak. So it's a new reality. Yesterday, he informed via his advisors that he would like to call and to talk to the advisor of Mr. Putin together with the advisor of President Zelensky and to see how this framework will go. So, Donatas, there are many options in this sense. And to tell you the truth, I'm still making this example all of the time. When the Yalta Peace Conference was happening in 1945, no one was talking to Hitler. For a moment, we are still talking to Putin in this sense. So just two comparing situations.
Thank you. So the next person on the list was, yes. Yeah, it's you. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is to Professor Sims and Victoria. So, as we know...
Sorry, can you just give your name and your affiliation?
Oh, yeah. I'm Mingxuan Yang. I'm a member of the MPhil program in Politics and International Studies. And my question is to Professor Sims and Victoria. It's about like 2025, this year will be a very difficult year for Ukraine on the battleground, which is complicated by President Trump's re-election. And so actually we still don't know his plan, but actually according to the preliminary report, his plan includes 3 points. First, there will be a ceasefire agreement on the current battle line. And second, the battle line will be guarded by European troops, but not the US troops. Third, Ukraine will be banned from joining NATO for at least 20 years. So considering the domestic costs and a lot of humanitarian crisis and the loss of population, the change of the demographic structure of Ukraine, do you think this kind of compromise can be accepted by Ukrainians and can be accepted in Ukraine's political circle? And how do you evaluate the political prospect of this kind of compromise proposed by Trump administration?
You go first and I will check the data just to come.
Well, I think, Victoria, it's really a question for you because it's a question about what Ukraine's response will be, if I understand you rightly. I know you addressed it to me, but I think I would hesitate to ventriloquize the
Also include how do you evaluate the prospect of this agreement in general? This is to you, Professor. Yeah. Like, will Russia accept that with this prospect in geopolitics? Yeah.
So your question is, would Russia, you haven't actually outlined the agreement, but if we are following what we know or think we know about what Trump is proposing or his team is proposing, it seems to be something like an immediate ceasefire on the existing front lines and then a negotiation which would involve, we hear, some form of major concessions on the Ukrainian side. I personally don't think that Putin will accept an immediate ceasefire because for all kinds of reasons, to do with his own internal dynamic, to do with the danger of allowing Ukraine to enter some kind of Western orbit to gain Western guarantees, possibly even Western troops deployed. But I'll leave the Ukrainian part of that question to Victoria.
Thank you so much for both parts of your question. So as far as I understood correctly, is on which conditions Ukrainians will accept the ceasefire, right? So that's kind of things. We Ukrainians say that, without security assurances as strong as NATO membership, and I'm reading just the poll, that's why I wanted the Professor Sims to give the floor first. For the percentage, more than 55% of the Ukrainians, even more, 65 when we are thinking in a nutshell, are considering this the only option. Why? And I definitely agree here with Professor Sims, because this time gap that Russia is willing to have is for rearm, regroup, reattack. Economically speaking, it's not only Ukraine who is ready for that. European countries are not ready for that, in a sense. Under which conditions, as I was, if I understood correctly your questions, Ukraine will be ready to accept it when they're going to have the security guarantees proved before any talks or entering any talks, not during, because the security cannot be the bargaining chip by any chances. And that's the strict condition. That's why I'm here, as Professor Sims is explaining, advocating an explanation here in this audience. Because when the bargaining chip is the security of your country, this is not a bargaining chip at all. Again, it's a time loop. even if financially and economically Russia is deteriorating, and we haven't touched upon that, and I'm happy to give you those figures, as we are doing, for example, in Kyiv School of Economics, every month, monitoring how the sanctions mechanism is working, but not only the sanctions. The Russian economy is not working well, in a nutshell. That's why it needs these public political agreements with something to make it a kind of a foreign PR. But at the same time, Russia will not be willing to accept any kind of the bargaining chip for a moment, because it has the opportunity to buy for more. Because the people in the West, what we call collective West, will be doubting and asking when this peace negotiation is going to happen. That will be much more pressure on Ukraine than Putin is demanding even. That's the paradox, actually.
Thank you. Yes, Suzanne. Yeah. Oh, was it you?
No, I didn't know I was asking one, but I can ask one. But you.
Sorry, can I just follow up on that? Really, sorry, I'm Amber Rudd, former Home Secretary, and for a brief moment today, a glorious Prime Minister. Anyway, hasn't gone to my head at all. I bow to no one for being so impressed and in awe of what the Ukrainians have done. The public, the fighting, the strength, the bravery, everything. 2025, as you've said, we now have Trump. I agree with what would be a desirable outcome with what you've said. But are we being realistic? Because Trump is not going to stand up for Ukraine like Joe Biden did. And in the UK, Boris Johnson gave all sorts of commitments to Zelensky. But it feels to me, as an outsider, that the outcome that we want for Ukraine, which is a security guarantee so that you can rebuild, so that we can build on some sort of consensus, is not, I don't know who's going to provide that. And we may be slow to get there, but it doesn't feel that the US are going to. I don't think the Europeans are going to. So I just, I don't know, I don't really have a question for you. I just share this concern. Sorry.
I totally share this concern, because that's our concern as well. But there is a big difference of the concerns. The battleground, kinetically speaking, is happening in my country. Yes. And that's one of the biggest differences in all of the momentum. So when we are projecting about the future, for me to be back to my students to say something about projecting the future, or to the people who are living in Ukraine, that's not the reason or the argument I should take into. That's why we are here discussing. There is actually a moment, and I'm quoting here our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andriy Sybiga. The negotiations with the Trump administration already started long before he already became today as a new president, which obvious reasons. Keith Kellogg was planning to be in Kyiv before inauguration, then the dates have changed. Now there is this visit is very much expected in Kyiv to happen, I think in the very nearest future, to be precisely. And that's one of the points where the big negotiations, what we say, diplomatical battlefield is going to happen, because that's another very invisible front. Not only civil society experts like I am doing that, but the diplomats are on this stance. Last but not least, businesses are going to be on the battlefield. And that's actually, I'm very slightly more positive than you are in this sense. And we are selling it as a bargaining chip to US businesses. Because I will point one very important thing. This military assistance that US was finally provided in the last, or to be precisely in the last days of Biden administration, they are not military aid per se. This is a kind of what we say, what Ukraine will be investing in the US. I'm not confusing the information. Production. So we are investing into the US economy, asking to give us more weapons. We are investing. And it's a very reasonable moment for Donald Trump, who thinks as a businessman in this sense. That's true. And that's already been happening, yes, during the Biden administration, but I believe it has potential. I will be very diplomatic here because it has potential. How are we gonna, as Ukrainians, use this potential? But what more importantly, how you guys gonna use this potential together with us? That's, I think, the secret to this bargaining chip.
If you want to chip in at any point.
Very briefly on that. Again, sort of one of your earlier points, when you look at then what that can mean for the population, it's the conditions of return. You know, when people leave their country, we've seen this in every conflict in recent time, they stay as close as possible, generally speaking. The vast majority of people, they stay as close as possible to wait to see when the moment is right to be able to come back and what are the conditions of return. And of course, in whatever will come out of all of that, people will then make their decisions on if they will go back and or if not. And then you get into all of that discussion around what does the economy look like with either a good return of people or a lot of people staying out, you know, forever, basically, as well. And then with the additional potential drain of people leaving.
So Suzanne Rain does have a question.
Well, it's prompted.
Could you just say who you
I'm
are?
sorry, I'm Suzanne Rain from the Centre for Geopolitics, and this is prompted by a couple of times, Victoria, you've talked about the economy and businessmen and about the Russian economy, and I wanted to ask your views on the success or otherwise of the sanctions, and particularly, you know, the activities of the shadow fleet. So are we in the West, who say we're Ukraine's closest allies and we're doing everything we possibly can, are we actually being at all effective through our implementation of things that we have set up precisely to help you? But then I think when they do those, you know, how many people have actually been sanctioned, how many people have actually been arrested, it's a tiny, tiny number. So are you disappointed with the, I don't know, you can be diplomatic, but with the implementation of what looked
and
like
I'm being recorded, you know?
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. It's a very important complex of questions, actually, that you raised. First of all, why one complex is the efficiency of sanctions, whether it can be done more. Yes, to be short in your account. How the sanctions are working, and I'm here having actually an executive summary of Kyiv School of Economics. They are doing, let's say, together with Yermak Mark Fall group, they are doing what we say monitoring of how efficiency of the sanction was hitting the Russian economy. So that's why I'm using this data as we speak. That's why you see laptop in front of me, because I really want to put it more in the economic data. So not only the arguments that I'm making as, let's say, expert. So definitely, and shadow fleet, sorry, maybe I'll even start with this one. I really want to look at those media experts who created this term shadow fleet, because there is no shadow, there is just fleet, you know? I will explain you why. There is what we say GPS navigation, so everyone sees everyone everywhere, so there is no shadow. Yes, they are under the radars, specifically now in the Baltic Sea. We haven't mentioned that and touched upon how Russia is on the horizontal escalation and is trying to keep a storm in other horizons or in other theaters. And the cable interconnector between Sweden and Poland is one of the examples. So Poland is very much alarmed in that. As well as before that, you've heard definitely about Finland. And of course, the touching upon of the three cables, very important one. In the Baltic Sea. So that's, and of course, shadow fleet as a concept is not shadow, because everyone sees everyone in a nutshell. And in this respect, I want also to say how much Greek authorities were helping us specifically to indicate this shadow fleet that didn't become a shadow under different radars and different, what we say, flags. That's one point of your question. The second point, I'm finally coming to the sanctions mechanism. Definitely we are preparing, we are waiting for the 16th package of the EU sanctions, and we were very much welcoming on 10th of January this year the US sanctions, finally, on one block of the things. Speaking to larger audience, I really want to share this, not concern, but literally, some of the Western components are still in the missiles and not only missiles, that are hitting Ukrainian critical and civilian infrastructure. Our partner organization where I worked, Independent Anti-Corruption Center, was presenting last week in Hague specifically what were these components that were used in last 2024 in order to hit Ukrainian civilians in a nutshell. There are many of them. And Russian economy is trying to be hit by the sanctions, yes, but the effect is very slow. If to be short with the dates and procedures, definitely there is Russia was trying what we say to do fiscal adrenaline into its economy. So using all of the important mechanisms, specifically from the central bank, in order to keep it on the radar and not allowing ruble to decrease so rapidly as in reality it is happening. So Russia's currency started depreciation again as of December 2024 in the fall, and the pace of this development has accelerated in recent weeks. One of the reasons for that is sanctions. Do we want that this important moment is taken into consideration? Yes. And there are many of Ukrainian experts, our partner organization, who are working in Washington as we speak in order to detect what private companies who are producing these elements should be on the sanction list. And I think you're going to hear that in spring 2025.
Thank you. So we've got about another 15 minutes. Is anybody here who's got a question about the Red Cross? Yes, Adam.
Yes, thank you. Adam Were, you've already heard who I am here at CFG. My question actually is directly to the Red Cross because it's a theme that came up through the day today. And bearing in mind the delicacy of the question, I'll leave it to you to decide how to respond. But I wonder if you could comment on the interplay between the politics of migration in Europe and your work as a humanitarian organisation. And how do you think that plays out as we look forward to a difficult 2025 and even beyond?
Can I ask you to expand a bit on that? I mean, what's in your mind when you ask?
So I'm thinking particularly about the fact that when we've witnessed mass migration events in Europe in the last 15 years, it's created effects both foreseen and unforeseen in domestic politics, which themselves then have become a factor in who is able to move where and how and in what circumstances. And given that you are the most neutral of organisations, how do you deal with those sort of trends within governments and dealing with the political ministerial classes and so on?
Yeah, sure. And as you know, the most neutral of organisations and that we obviously try to stick to that so that we remain credible and trusted and not seen as interfering in that. Of course, what we try to do is always pivot and steer conversations back to need and what's the best policy to deal with a large human and sometimes humanitarian problem. How can governments adapt to that? What are applicable legal frameworks where relevant as well? And I think then the wider bit of that for us is we have to still navigate that. We are very aware of those narratives, those challenges, those societal trends, kind of shifting politics, left-right discussions, and how that affects us, how that can affect us in a funding sense as well. That we're under immense funding pressure and all humanitarian agencies, by the way. It's not something unique to us or targeted in some way towards the Red Cross, but in part because of those societal trends and narratives and conversations, our funding becomes quite squeezed as well, or we become perceived as being overly attached to what might become unpopular trends and discussions. And I think, maybe to draw a contrast of what we saw with the response to Ukrainians that we didn't see to, in the UK to other refugee populations was much greater ease of Ukrainians first coming to the UK and then establishing themselves. And I'm sure many people in this room would have met a Ukrainian person who had, within 24 hours, found a job and was working, and how impressive that felt. But it was because they were given that ability from their arrival, and that wasn't something that we saw in all cases. We don't make advisory on that. That is for government to decide here, as it would be in any other country. But it, of course, led to a big difference of how Ukrainians were able to manage that. I think maybe the last kind of point on that is how, again, it's really going to depend what happens and if Ukrainians are able to go home. And I don't have, I'm quite envious of all the data that you have in front of you, and I've been noting that, and I have this silly red book in front of me. But there must be as well on data on kind of how communities across Europe who are, and it's not just Europe of course, but primarily in Europe, who are hosting Ukrainians, how attitudes have probably shifted over time as people stay for 1 month, 2 months, and then 2-3 years, and then indefinitely. And the pressure that puts on people, the pressure that puts on services. And again, sometimes then obviously we want, as humanitarians, our natural reflex is to try and support and assist inside that. There are limits to what we can do and what we should do. And obviously states have to step into that as well. So again, I think that's one of the most controversial, probably, on a societal level, examples of where like the humanitarian meets the political, for sure. Of course, for future questions, I've been greatly enjoying listening to Victoria as well. So I'm very happy to sit here and listen just about Ukraine as well.
Thank you. So there's a gentleman in the baseball hat there who's been waiting patiently.
Thank you. My name is Dylan Prochnicki, and if my baseball cap didn't give it away, I'm an American affiliated with the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm also of Polish extraction, and so I share the great admiration for what the Ukrainian people have done for the past couple of years. However, I also share the sentiment that Ukrainian NATO membership is a political impossibility for the Americans. For Trump and his coterie, and that he has a bilateral negotiation style. And I suppose to get to the question, I wonder, Professor Sims and Victoria, if you think that given this bias he has towards bilateralism, the current, and I suppose this is maybe an American perspective, but the current weakness of European political leaders will rob the table of advocates for a more stable and secure situation for Ukraine whenever folks get to the table?
Easy question as well. I will try to say, I was expressing before the Ukrainian wishes and Ukrainian people, that's definitely, and to take into account what the legal framework exists for that. So the legal framework for anything else doesn't exist for a moment, let's be frank, right? There are seeds of the political willingness or seeds of political framework being created. Yes, it's going to be one of the hardest, I think, choices for all of us Ukrainian experts, those who are working abroad and those who are working in Ukraine, to do our work day and night. We don't have holidays, we don't have vacations, we don't have anything. We are literally working 24/7. That's why we're very much tired, in a nutshell, when we don't see progress within the efforts that we're making. But taking all of the emotions out and just bringing clear it to the table, yes, the discussions within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine is, of course, taking, as I was mentioning before, to the ground what will be the portfolio before Kit Kello comes to Kyiv in order to explain the position of Ukrainian officials, which remarks or backs us what the Ukrainian people are willing. That's what I was trying to say in the polls and the data. From personal, professional point of view, we will need to create something, that's for sure, because it doesn't exist. We definitely know that there is a, not fatigue, but not willingness for a moment to see Ukraine as a short-term or in a short-term goal NATO member. At the same time, we also are trying to say that European security architecture is crumbling because of that. because the new area of the gray zone is being created just on where the NATO sphere of influence is and where the NATO allies are. That's why this important role of Romania, in a nutshell, with Bulgaria and Turkey, because they have this regional cooperation that they established more than 1 year ago for a moment, is into our radar as well. We have to work with our neighbors because United States is far. We have more than 2,000 kilometers of border with Russian Federation. And geographically speaking, we are not in the different universe. So we will have to think about your future, taking into account our geographical and strategic position in this sense. So definitely, therefore, you hear a lot of positions, specifically in the simulations, why I was explaining the specific role of Romania in this sense and the Baltic states, who are trying to help us to navigate and to talk with not only European leaders, but specifically US leaders. And specific role of Giorgia Meloni, and I'm Italian expert by my background, by the way, so we do see it as a momentum of very interesting creative approach, if I may say so. I don't say it's going to work because we don't know. And unfortunately, I'm not a magician. I don't have a crystal ball to tell you how the 2025 going to be. But, and it's not something a secret, if we are still going to maintain this solidarity track with us, with Ukrainians, 2026 is going to be much more pivotal in this sense. Why? Because the production lines of some of the European tech and defense giants is going to be in action, as well as some of the procurement that we already had since 2022 and 23 is going to be slowly, but moving.
Thank you. We've got a few more minutes now. Is there anybody at the back who perhaps I haven't seen who'd like to ask a question? If so, stand up. I don't see anybody. Are there any more questions? I have one, but yes, Boris, you can have the last one from the floor.
Thank you. I believe it is already the war of attrition.
Sorry, could you say, give us your name and your affiliation, please?
Sorry, Boris Kashnikov, Polis. Since it is already the war of attrition, we are...
Sorry, Boris. His affiliation is Polis, visiting fellow. Yeah.
Since it is already the war of attrition, we are supposed to compare uncomparable. So we are supposed to find the most weak point in Ukraine and compare it with the most weak point in Russian situation, if it is possible at all. On my estimation, the weak point for Ukraine is, or we may only wish that the resilience of Ukrainian population will last longer. And in the Russian case, we may only hope that its already overheated economy will burst out all of a sudden. How do you think, do you agree with me that these are the weak points? And is it possible to compare these two things?
It's for you, I think.
To you, Victoria.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. I don't think it's a relevant question per se, but I feel what you wanted to compare. So literally to see what's at stake, right? If I'm trying to paraphrase your question correctly, and to see in a nutshell what might be. You're definitely an expert on Russian Federation, so literally I would like also to ask you the question whether it's might be the potential, what you think. I'm very interested actually because it's not because I'm from Ukraine, but I'm very interested in other points. So that's per se. I don't believe that the resilience of Ukraine is a bargaining chip or it's gonna be decreasing. 800 years are proven we are not. Why other 2 years or 3 might be a case if 800 years were literally proven that we are quite resilient, to tell the truth, and we will keep that momentum. Because we are talking about our homeland, and it's something very sacred, even in our culture. So never touching Ukrainians with the land. because we're going to fight back in this sense. So, and well, we are proving it not only with the 2 years or 12 years, more than 800 years. I really wanted to hear also your point about whether it's the weak point that I mentioned for the Russian economy and stagnant, which I believe the another component we are not mentioning before, Russian people. And in this sense, being killed or in the captivity more than 1 million for a moment, why it's not a turning point? That's my question, actually, to if I may ask so. And, well, understanding where these soldiers or those who were civilian and became soldiers from the Russian troops are coming from, I understand the point of the Russian authorities. You will never see the people of the Russian troops out of Moscow or St. Petersburg or some other, what we say, elite regions or cities. But you will see different other regions. So it means that Russian authorities are not taking care at all. And it's something definitely not the case for our nation as well as our people. So we do care about ourselves.
Thank you. So Victoria's asked a question I think that is very much in everybody's minds, which is what the position looks like on the Russian side of the hill with respect to resilience. So with your permission, I'm going to ask Professor Kashnikov to give his assessment for 1 or 2 minutes, not more, answering Victoria's question, and you will then in fact have had the last word.
I'm not an expert in economy, but I have a feeling that the economy is overheated, of course, and it may burst out any moment, in fact. When it comes to the Russian people, unfortunately, I do not share your view, because it is a mercenary army, what we have in Russia, and it may continue this way. It is only a matter of payment. And in Moscow or in St. Petersburg, they do not care about this war at all, since other people are ready to hire to take part in this war. And, well, some faraway regions are flourishing now because of all this money, which all of a sudden are coming for those who fall in the battle and those, well, the payment. So to some extent, people may be happy with this kind of salaries and payments coming because of this war.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. We have to finish the formal part of this evening's proceedings now, but not before doing 3 things. First of all, to invite you all to stay tuned to the Centre for Geopolitics. Look us up on the website. We've got many events, both in person, as is the case now, but also online events. Secondly, I'd like to invite all of you to join us for a glass of wine, which I hope is now ready in the back. Yes, I see a positive signs. And thirdly, of course, to thank our splendid panel, Dr. Victoria Vidovichenko and Rory Moylan, for their remarks and for sharing their expertise with us. Thank you very much.